Under a sky stained with ash and clouded by industrial fumes, Leora stumbled through the grimy market streets. The mud clung to her slender, iridescent skin like a second skin, mocking her every step. Life on Jorith had long ago become a struggle since the human corporations drained the planet of its resources. The local Terrian community, once thriving, now lived in the shadows of towering metallic refineries. Leora's parents were trapped in endless shifts at the extraction mines, reduced from respected healers to mere laborers. She kept her head low, avoiding the piercing gazes of humans and wealthier off-world aliens who roamed the market, flaunting their polished clothes and pristine skin. Leora had learned early to endure their stares and sneers. Her reality was dirt, and dreams were dangerous. On this ordinary day, the hologram of Emery Steele, the human CEO of Steele Enterprises, illuminated the skies. His voice, firm and calculated, echoed through the bustling marketplace. "One candidate from each planet will join our interstellar program. A chance to leave your world behind and shape the future." The crowd murmured in awe. Leora paused, her heart catching in her chest. A glimpse of something impossible sparked inside her, a hope she had long buried. Leora stood motionless, the words of Emery Steele hanging in the air like a distant promise. Round her, murmurs grew into excitement, aliens whispering about their chances, humans speculating who might be chosen. It felt impossible. A Terrian girl from the slums. What chance did she have against the privileged elites who would certainly submit polished applications backed by powerful recommendations? But what if? The thought refused to let go, weaving itself into her mind like a stubborn thread. Leora shook her head, forcing her feet to move again through the market, but the possibility clung to her like the mud she couldn't escape. It gnawed at her during her walk home, through narrow alleys where forgotten souls lived in makeshift tents, remnants of Jorith's golden age. When she reached the shack she called home, her mother and father were already slumped at the uneven wooden table. Their faces, once full of wisdom and light, were now etched with exhaustion, years of relentless labor under the human regime weighing them down. Her father, Oran, barely lifted his head. "You're late," he murmured, though there was no accusation in his voice, just weariness. "I stayed to watch the announcement," Leora replied, setting her satchel on the floor. "They're taking applications for Steele Enterprises' interstellar program. Someone from every planet gets a spot." Her mother, Mira, let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Someone from every planet, yes. But not someone like us." She tore a piece of stale bread in half and placed it on the table, her hands trembling slightly. "You know who they'll pick. Those who dress like them, speak like them, and live in those ivory towers." "I know, but..." Leora hesitated, twisting her fingers together. "What if I tried? What if I could leave?" Oran sighed deeply, rubbing his temple. "You've always been a dreamer, Leora. But dreaming doesn't fill bellies. The humans don't see us as equals. They see us as dirt beneath their boots." The weight of his words settled heavily on her, but deep within, she felt something stir. The mud on her skin, the grime that clung to her every step, she'd lived with it her whole life. But what if, just this once, she could prove that mud was only skin deep? "I have to try," she whispered, more to herself than to them. That night, as the wind howled through the cracks in their roof, Leora sat at the small table with a crumpled piece of paper and a worn-out pen. While others would submit sleek digital portfolios, hers would be scrawled by hand, uneven, blotchy letters written with more determination than skill. She didn't have the education or resources the others did, but she had something they didn't. Nothing left to lose. Her parents had long since gone to bed, their breaths slow and steady in the quiet darkness. Leora dipped the pen into a small bottle of ink, her hands shaking slightly as she began to write. The words came slowly at first, awkward and hesitant, but with each line, she felt a little stronger. "This is my story, my only chance to leave Jorith and find something more." The next morning, She slipped the folded application into her satchel and set off toward the selection center, her heart pounding with every step. The walk was long, too long, through winding streets and across polluted streams that reeked of chemicals. But Leora kept moving, each step heavy with fear, but also with hope. By the time she reached the entrance of the towering Steel Enterprises building, her feet were caked in more mud than ever. The candidates standing in line were pristine, their skin glowing, their clothes immaculate. They whispered to one another, casting sidelong glances at her as she approached. Laura clenched her satchel tighter and stood at the back of the line, trying to ignore the snickers and stares. The others carried tablets, holograms, and polished resumes. All she had was a handwritten application and a dream she was afraid to admit, even to herself. The guard at the door, a human in a sleek black uniform, eyed her with mild disgust. "Name?" "Leora," she said firmly, despite the quiver in her heart. He glanced at his list, then gave a curt nod. "Go inside. Wait to be called." The moment she stepped through the doors, the vast hall swallowed her whole. Marble floors stretched beneath her feet, and walls of glass rose high above, reflecting the stormy sky outside. Dozens of candidates were seated in neat rows, scrolling through their portfolios with determined focus. Leora slipped into the last row, clutching her folded paper as if it were a lifeline. As the minutes turned to hours, she watched groups of candidates call forward one by one. Each time, they spoke confidently about their achievements, degrees earned on distant planets, inventions patented before adulthood, and families with influence. Their polished words echoed through the hall, making her crumpled application feel even smaller in her hands. The self-doubt began to creep in. "What am I doing here?" she thought, her heart sinking deeper with each passing minute. "I don't belong among them. I never did." And yet, a flicker of resolve burned quietly inside her. She had come this far, through mud, fear, and hopelessness. She couldn't back out now. Finally, her name echoed through the hall. "Leora," a voice called. She rose slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. The weight of every sneer, every dismissive glance, hung on her shoulders as she made her way to the front. The other candidates barely acknowledged her. She was just a mud-covered girl to them, someone they didn't need to worry about. But Leora knew something they didn't. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here because she had nothing left to lose, and that made her the most dangerous kind of competitor. She stepped into the interview room. Her heart pounded like a drum. At the center of the room sat Emery Steele, his piercing eyes sharp as daggers. His presence filled the space, radiating power and precision. He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together as he studied her with quiet intensity. "Why do you think you deserve this opportunity?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate. Laura swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the question settle into her bones. For a moment, the fear threatened to overwhelm her, but then she thought of her parents, of the mud, of the life she would be condemned to if she walked away now. She straightened her back, meeting his gaze with steady resolve. "I don't have fancy degrees or connections. I don't have wealth or status, but I've survived things that would break most people. I've fought every day just to keep going. And if you give me this chance," she paused, her voice steady but fierce, "I'll work harder than anyone. I'll prove that I belong." Steele said nothing at first, his cold, calculating gaze locked on hers. For a moment, the silence stretched so thin it felt like it might snap. And then, with the slightest nod, he gestured toward the door. "Thank you, Leora," he said, his tone unreadable. She left the room feeling both relieved and uncertain. Had she said enough? Had she done enough? The only thing she knew for sure was that she had given it everything she had. As she stepped back into the grand hall, the other candidates were still immersed in their conversations, unbothered, unfazed. But Laura, for the first time in her life, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Laura sank into one of the cold marble benches lining the grand hall, her heart still racing from the interview. Round her, the other candidates remained locked in lively discussions, exchanging polished words and subtle boasts. She pulled her tattered satchel closer to her side, trying to block out their voices. Every passing second chipped away at her nerves. Some candidates flipped through holographic resumes, others polished their carefully crafted presentations. Leora had nothing more than her mud-streaked clothes and a crumpled piece of paper, a sharp contrast against the sleek technology that gleamed in the hands of the privileged. She stared at the glass walls, watching as the storm outside battered the city, mirroring the whirlwind inside her. Her thoughts churned. What if I made a mistake? She wondered. What if my story, my struggle, wasn't enough? A group of humans nearby shared hushed laughter, glancing in her direction. Their perfectly groomed appearances and the arrogance in their voices felt suffocating. They didn't have to fight to be seen. They already belonged in this world of polished marble and reflective glass. Leora was just a visitor, a piece of dirt clinging to the edges, hoping for a miracle. But she reminded herself of something her mother had whispered to her the night before. If you don't try, you'll never know if you could have flown. The hours dragged on painfully. Groups of candidates were called up and whisked into interview rooms. Some left beaming, others with clenched jaws and downcast eyes. Leora couldn't help but feel invisible among them. No one spoke to her, no one looked at her beyond a dismissive glance. Just as the weight of her self-doubt threatened to crush her, a voice broke through the chatter. Leora. She looked up to see a tall woman with stern eyes and a sleek uniform standing at the entrance to another room. The woman gave no hint of emotion as she beckoned Leora to follow. Inside the small chamber, Emery Steele waited, seated at a sleek metallic table. His presence was just as commanding as before, yet this time, Leora felt his gaze linger on her a fraction longer. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps. He motioned to the empty seat across from him. Leora sat down slowly, folding her hands to keep them from shaking. "Tell me," Steele began, his voice smooth but cold, "if I gave you this opportunity, what would you do with it?" Leora hesitated, her mind racing. She knew that this wasn't just a question about her future. It was a test. A test to see if she was ready to leave everything behind. She took a deep breath. "I'd learn everything I could. I'd work harder than anyone else. And I'd come back." Steele's brow arched slightly. "Come back?" "Yes," Leora answered, her voice steady now. "I'd come back to Joreth. My planet has been left in ruins, and my people are barely surviving. If I'm given this chance, I'd use everything I learned to rebuild what was lost." Steele leaned back in his chair, studying her in silence. His eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed to measure every word she had spoken. Leora's heart pounded in her chest as the silence stretched between them. Finally, Steele's expression shifted, just the faintest flicker of something unreadable. He tapped a small device on the table, ending the interview with a curt nod. "Thank you, Leora," he said, his tone neutral. "You'll be notified of the decision soon." She stood, gave him a small bow out of habit, and exited the room, her heart thudding with uncertainty. The weight of what she had said hung over her. Would her honesty be enough, or had she sealed her fate? The next few days passed in agonizing limbo. Leora returned to the familiar grime of her neighborhood, waiting with a sense of dread that grew heavier with each passing hour. She spent her nights watching the rain slide down the cracked walls of their shack, and her mornings trying to distract herself with mundane chores. Her parents tried to keep her grounded, though even they had begun to hope in small, hesitant ways. Her father left small offerings of dried flowers on the kitchen table, for luck, just in case, he'd say. And her mother would hum softly when Leora came home, as if preparing for something good, even though none of them dared to say it out loud. The city buzzed with rumors. Names of potential candidates floated in the air like pollen in the wind, each whispered prediction stinging Leora with uncertainty. Then, on the third day, A metallic drone arrived at their front door. The sleek black delivery drone hovered silently, a glowing emblem of Steel Enterprises pulsing on its side. Leora's breath hitched as it scanned her face and dropped a small silver envelope into her hands before disappearing into the cloudy sky. Her parents stood behind her, holding their breath as she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single card, the edges shimmering faintly in the dim light. Printed in elegant lettering were the words, "Congratulations, you have been selected for the Steel Enterprises Interstellar program." For a moment, everything around Leora faded. The distant hum of machinery, the sound of rain against the roof, even her parents' sharp intake of breath. She stared at the card, her mind struggling to process the words. She had done it. Somehow, against all odds, she had been chosen. Her father was the first to speak, his voice filled with disbelief. "You did it," he whispered, as if saying it too loudly might shatter the moment. Her mother stepped forward, pulling Leora into a tight embrace. "You're going to leave this place," she murmured, her voice breaking with emotion. "You're going to fly." Leora felt tears well in her eyes, but she held them back. The battle wasn't over, not yet. Being chosen was only the beginning. With the acceptance card clutched tightly in her hand, she whispered to herself, "I'll prove to them that they didn't make a mistake." The day Leora left Jorith was unlike anything she had imagined. The rain, which had been a near constant in her life, had given way to a rare hazy sunlight. The streets shimmered with puddles of oily water, reflecting the towering steel refineries that dominated the skyline. She stood at the spaceport's entrance, clutching her satchel tightly, taking in the sight of the shuttle that would carry her far beyond her home planet's grim surface. Her parents stood silently behind her, unsure of what to say. Words felt too small for the moment. They had never imagined their daughter, covered in mud and burdened with hopeless dreams, would be standing at the threshold of a new life, one that would take her light years away. "Stay true to yourself," her father whispered, placing a weathered hand on her shoulder. "Don't let them change who you are." Her mother smiled faintly through tearful eyes. "Fly high, Leora, and don't look back." With a nod, Leora turned toward the boarding platform, the silver acceptance card still tucked in her pocket. The sleek shuttle loomed ahead, its surface gleaming beneath the artificial lights. She climbed aboard, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. As the doors sealed behind her with a hiss, she knew that this was the last time she would feel the familiar grit of Jorith beneath her feet. The inside of the shuttle was unlike anything Leora had ever seen. The seats were lined with smooth, dark fabric, and the walls were adorned with soft, glowing panels that radiated a calming blue light. A few other chosen candidates sat scattered throughout the cabin, most of them from wealthy families, their clothes immaculate, and their expressions indifferent. Leora kept her head down, sliding into an empty seat near the back. She tried to steady her breathing as the shuttle's engines roared to life. The ground trembled beneath her, and soon, the familiar gray skies of Jorith disappeared as the shuttle lifted into the vast emptiness of space. Leora's heart raced with a mixture of awe and disbelief. She was leaving the only world she had ever known, bound for the unknown. The other candidates chatted quietly, their voices full of confidence. They spoke about the advanced technology they had mastered and the important people they knew. Leora listened from the shadows, clutching her satchel and wondering, "How do I measure up against them?" The intercom crackled to life, and a smooth, automated voice announced their destination. Next stop, Steel Enterprises headquarters, orbiting Station E9. Arrival in 3 hours. Laura pressed her forehead against the window, watching the stars blur past. For the first time in her life, the universe stretched out before her, vast and full of possibilities. When the shuttle docked at Station E9, Laura's breath caught in her throat. The station was enormous, a glimmering ring that orbited a distant planet, its surface dotted with glowing lights and intricate walkways. Shuttles buzzed in and out of the docking bays, and beyond the glass walls, Leora could see massive ships under construction, vessels that would soon carry humans and other species to new worlds. The candidates were ushered into a gleaming corridor by a group of robotic assistants. They glided silently beside them, scanning each person's identification card and directing them toward their quarters. Leora trailed behind the others, feeling small and overwhelmed by the grandeur around her. As they entered the main hall, a voice echoed through the space, calm, controlled, and unmistakably familiar. "Welcome to Steele Enterprises headquarters," Emery Steele announced, his holographic image towering above them. His sharp eyes swept across the room, even through the projection, giving the sense that he could see each of them individually. "You are not just here to participate. You are here to excel. To survive in this program, you must prove yourselves at every turn. Only the best will rise to the top." Laura felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew that this journey would not be easy, and she could already sense the tension among the candidates. Some stood a little straighter, while others exchanged glances full of silent challenge. Everyone here was determined to be the best, and Leora was determined not to be left behind. They were led to their quarters, each candidate assigned a small room with a bed, a desk, and a narrow window that looked out into space. It wasn't much, but to Leora, it felt like luxury compared to the crumbling walls and leaking roof of her home on Joreth. She sat on the edge of the bed, pulling the acceptance card from her pocket and running her fingers over the smooth surface. This is real. The thought settled over her like a weight and a promise. She was really here, and she had no intention of failing. A sharp chime echoed through the room, followed by a message displayed on the wall panel. "Orientation begins at 600. Be prepared." Leora lay back on the bed, exhaustion creeping over her, but sleep didn't come easily. Her mind raced with thoughts of the challenges ahead. She knew that every day here would be a test, not just of her skills, but of her willpower. And she would have to fight harder than anyone else to prove that she deserved this chance. The next morning, Leora stood among the other candidates in the sleek training hall, waiting for the program to begin. Emery Steele himself entered the room, flanked by a team of instructors. His presence was commanding, his gaze sharp as he surveyed the group. "You have been chosen from thousands," Steele began, his voice calm but firm. "But make no mistake, being chosen was the easy part. From now on, every task, every decision, will determine whether you belong here. If you fail, you will be sent back to your homeworld." Laura's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. There would be no room for mistakes, no second chances. This was it. Steele's gaze flickered toward her for the briefest moment, and Leora straightened her back. She knew that everyone here had something to prove, but for her it was more than that. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her parents, for her people, for Joreth. And she would not fail. The room was silent, filled with tension thick enough to cut. Emery Steele stood at the front, his sharp eyes scanning the group. Leora could feel his gaze like a weight pressing down on her, testing her resolve without words. She knew this was only the beginning. Her first test was just moments away, and failure was not an option. The instructors handed out sleek, transparent tablets, each displaying the same message. First challenge: problem solving and innovation. "You'll work in pairs," Steele announced, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. "Each pair must develop a strategy to solve a simulated planetary crisis within the next 24 hours. The task isn't just to solve the problem, but to do it better than anyone else." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Leora's stomach churned with uncertainty as the candidates began pairing up, some with friends, others with familiar faces. She stood alone, clutching her tablet, until a voice broke through the noise. "You, Tyrion, you're with me." Laura turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered human boy standing beside her. His neatly styled hair and sharp uniform made him look every bit like someone who belonged here. His expression was unreadable, but his tone carried a hint of annoyance, as if being paired with her was already a compromise. "I'm Callan," he said flatly. "Let's get this over with." Laura gave a small nod, unwilling to let his tone unsettle her. She was used to people underestimating her, and she knew how to stay quiet and focused. Actions spoke louder than words. They found a small corner of the room to work, the tablet between them projecting a glowing hologram of a planet in crisis. The challenge was grim. A resource supply line had been cut off by hostile forces, leaving a colony on the brink of starvation. Their task was to propose a sustainable solution that would avoid conflict and secure the colony's survival. Callan immediately began pulling up data files, his fingers flying across the tablet. "We need to negotiate with the hostiles. If we offer them trade rights or technology, they might let the supply routes open again." Laura frowned, crossing her arms. "That only works if they care about trade. What if they don't?" Callan glanced at her, his expression impatient. "Do you have a better idea?" Laura leaned forward, scanning the data on the hologram. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of information: climate reports, population statistics, supply inventories. Then, something clicked. "The planet's atmosphere is dense," she said, pointing to a section of the data. "What if we deploy autonomous drones to harvest resources from the ocean floor? We wouldn't need to rely on the blocked supply routes at all." Callan raised an eyebrow. "Underwater drones. Do you know how complicated that is?" Laura met his gaze steadily. "Not as complicated as negotiating with hostiles who might not want to talk." For a moment, Callan stared at her, as if reassessing his initial judgment. Then, to her surprise, he gave a slight nod. "All right, let's try it your way." The next 24 hours were a blur of brainstorming, calculations, and rapid simulations. Leora and Callan worked through the night, testing their ideas and refining their proposal. Callan's technical expertise was impressive, and though he didn't say it aloud, Leora knew he was surprised by her insight and problem-solving skills. By the time they submitted their final plan, exhaustion weighed heavily on them both. They stood side by side as the instructors reviewed each team's proposal. Leora's heart pounded with anticipation. This was her first real test, and everything depended on it. Finally, Emery Steele approached, his expression as unreadable as ever. He scanned through the holographic proposals, his sharp eyes flickering across the data. When he reached Leora and Callan's plan, he paused. A flicker of curiosity crossed his face as he studied the details of their underwater drone system. "Interesting," he murmured, though his voice remained neutral. "You took an unconventional approach." Callan stiffened beside her, but Leora stayed calm. Unconventional. That could mean either success or failure. She waited, holding her breath. Steele gave a slight nod. "This will do." It wasn't praise exactly, but it wasn't rejection either. Relief washed over Leora like a tidal wave. They had passed the first challenge. She wasn't going home, not yet. As the candidates filed out of the room, Callan gave her a sidelong glance. "Not bad, Tyrion. Maybe you're not as out of place here as I thought." Laura allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was the closest thing to an acknowledgement she would get from him. The first challenge was over, but Leora knew the road ahead would only get harder. Each task would push her further, testing not just her intelligence, but her resilience, her courage, and her ability to adapt. She glanced at the glowing sign above the exit, which read, "Challenge 1, complete. Next challenge awaiting." And as she walked toward the exit, her heart steady and her resolve unshaken, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was going to prove to everyone, including herself, that she belonged here. The days following the first challenge passed in a blur of exhaustion and anticipation. Each new challenge was harder than the last, and the atmosphere among the candidates grew tense. Conversations became sharper, alliances more strategic. Every interaction felt like a calculated move, and Leora could feel the pressure mounting. There were no friends here, only competitors vying for the same opportunity to rise to the top. Leora worked silently, avoiding the petty politics unfolding around her. She kept her focus on each task, knowing that every challenge brought her closer to proving herself. Callan, her partner from the first challenge, had kept his distance since their success. He had his own ambitions, and though they occasionally exchanged nods in passing, neither felt the need to force a friendship. But Leora didn't mind. She was used to walking alone. The latest challenge was the hardest yet, a grueling survival simulation. Each candidate was dropped into an artificially generated environment designed to push them to their limits. The goal was simple: survive for 72 hours, using only the supplies provided and whatever resources they could scavenge along the way. Leora's environment was a dense swamp-like terrain filled with toxic plants and hidden dangers. The air was thick with humidity, making it hard to breathe, and the ground squelched beneath her feet with every step. She moved cautiously through the muck, scanning her surroundings for anything useful. The simulation had been designed to test not just physical endurance but mental strength. Food was scarce and the weather shifted unpredictably, torrential rains followed by blistering heat. The other candidates were scattered across different zones, meaning she had to navigate the challenge entirely on her own. As the hours stretched into days, exhaustion gnawed at her bones. Her muscles ached from wading through the thick swamp, and hunger clawed at her stomach. But Leora refused to give up. She scavenged what little food she could find, building crude shelters to protect herself from the elements. On the second night, the swamp grew eerily silent. Leora huddled beneath her makeshift canopy, her body shivering from the cold. In the darkness, doubts began to creep in. What if I can't do this? What if I fail? But then she thought of her parents, of the sacrifices they had made, the hopes they dared not speak aloud. She thought of the mud-streaked streets of Joreth, of the life she was determined to leave behind. Failure wasn't an option. By the third day, Leora's body was nearing its limit. Her limbs felt heavy, and her vision blurred from dehydration. She knew she had to push through. Just a few more hours. She stumbled through the swamp, determined to reach the extraction point before her strength gave out completely. That's when she heard the sound. A faint rustling in the undergrowth, followed by the snap of a branch. Leora froze, her heart pounding. She wasn't alone. From the shadows emerged a fellow candidate, a tall alien with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. His expression was unreadable, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked at her, as if weighing whether she was worth helping or worth eliminating as competition. "You look like you could use some help," the alien said smoothly, though there was no kindness in his voice. Leora's instincts screamed at her to stay cautious. In the simulation, alliances could form, or betrayals could happen just as easily. "I'll manage," Leora replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her limbs. She couldn't afford to show weakness. The alien gave a slow, mocking smile. "Suit yourself." With a shrug, he disappeared back into the swamp, leaving Leora alone once more. By the time she reached the extraction point, Leora was barely standing. Her clothes were soaked through, and her skin was scraped and bruised from the harsh terrain. But she had made it. She had survived. The instructors were waiting at the extraction site, their expressions impassive as they scanned her identification and marked her completion time. Leora collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, her body trembling with relief. Emery Steele's voice echoed through the simulation as the other candidates began to arrive. "Survival isn't just about strength," he said, his tone calm but authoritative. "It's about endurance, adaptability, the will to persevere when everything around you tells you to stop." Leora closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. She had survived, not because she was the strongest, but because she had refused to give up. And that, she knew, was what would set her apart from the others. As the simulation ended and the candidates were escorted back to the main station, Leora felt a quiet sense of triumph settle over her. Each challenge had pushed her further, but she had risen to meet them all. And she wasn't done yet. The air in the main hall of Steel Enterprises was thick with tension. Leora stood among the remaining candidates, half of them already eliminated by the previous challenges. Only a few remained, their eyes weary but determined. This was it, the final test. Emery Steele entered the hall, his presence commanding as ever. His dark suit shimmered under the artificial lights, and his cold, calculating gaze swept across the group. "You have survived the challenges so far," he began, "but survival alone isn't enough. For this final test, I want to see not just what you can endure, but what you can create. The future demands ingenuity, resilience, and the ability to lead." Silence settled over the room. The candidates exchanged wary glances, sensing that this challenge would be unlike anything they had faced before. Steele tapped a small device on his wrist, and a holographic display materialized in the air, showing a blueprint of a colony ship. "Your task," he continued, "is to design a new type of colony vessel, something that can survive deep space exploration and support life for generations. You'll have 6 hours to develop your plan." Laura's heart raced. This wasn't just a test of survival or strength, it was a test of vision. And for the first time, she felt a spark of excitement. She didn't have the polished education of the others, but she knew how to solve problems. She knew how to think differently. The clock started. Laura worked furiously, her fingers flying across the tablet as she sketched out designs and inputted calculations. The other candidates huddled together, pooling their knowledge and resources. Leora, however, worked alone, trusting her instincts, knowing that she had come this far by relying on herself. Her design was unconventional. Most colony ships focused on maximizing speed and efficiency, but Leora's plan revolved around adaptability. She envisioned a modular ship, one that could change its structure mid-flight, adjusting to different environments and challenges. Her hands trembled slightly as she refined the blueprint, adding features that would allow the ship to harness energy from nearby stars and self-repair its systems using nanotechnology. It was ambitious, maybe even reckless, but it was her vision, and she believed in it. As the final minutes ticked away, Laura submitted her design with a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The other candidates finished their projects too, their faces tense with anticipation. Emery Steele and a panel of engineers moved between the groups, reviewing each design with sharp, critical eyes. Leora stood quietly, watching as the judges discussed the merits of each proposal. She couldn't hear their words, but she could see the way they nodded thoughtfully, or dismissed a project with a single glance. When the panel reached her, Leora's heart felt like it might burst. Steele studied her design for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The other judges murmured quietly, their eyes flickering between the blueprint and the exhausted girl standing before them. "This is bold," one of the judges remarked, tilting his head slightly. "Unorthodox." Steele gave a small nod, his gaze still fixed on Laura. "But it has potential." The results were announced an hour later. Leora stood among the other candidates, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The room was so quiet that she could hear the hum of the air vents and the distant thrum of engines outside the station. Emery Steele stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. "One candidate will be chosen today to join our interstellar program. The rest will return to their homeworlds, knowing that they gave their best." He paused, his sharp gaze sweeping across the group one last time. "And the one chosen to lead the future." Steele's eyes locked onto Laura, "is Leora of Joreth." For a moment, everything stood still. Leora felt a wave of disbelief wash over her, followed by a swell of emotion so powerful it left her breathless. She had done it. She had won. The other candidates stared in stunned silence, some with disbelief, others with thinly veiled resentment. But Leora didn't care. She had proven them wrong. Every sneer, every doubt, every dismissive glance. She had come from nothing, from the mud and grime of a forgotten world, and she had risen higher than anyone had ever expected. Steele approached her, his expression still cool and unreadable, but there was something new in his gaze, a flicker of respect. "You'll begin your training immediately," he said, handing her a small datapad. "The work will be hard. There will be no guarantees of success. Are you ready?" Laura met his gaze with steady determination. "I was born ready." Steele gave a slight nod. "Good. Then welcome to the future." That night, as Leora lay in her new quarters aboard the space station, staring out at the endless expanse of stars, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment settle over her. She had fought for this, every step of the way, and she knew that her journey was only just beginning. The mud on her skin, the doubts in her heart, they were behind her now. Ahead of her lay the stars, and with them, the promise of a new future. For the first time in her life, Leora didn't feel like she was running away from something. She was running toward it.